Greetings, my name is Michael Mendoza, and in this discussion, I will examine a subject I've really never given much thought to. That is the topic of the difference between freedom and liberty. See, I think that most people use the two terms interchangeably. After all, a thesaurus might identify the two words as synonymous. Jeff Gregory McName is the author or title page editor of 40 different books. He is also a contributing editor to the Encyclopedia Britannica. In an article titled Of Freedom and Liberty, McName wrote, "But freedom is one of those slippery words that is often defined by its absence. It's a concept that philosophers have interpreted, well, rather freely. Even when translating the ancient Greek, the word eleutheria, most scholars use freedom and liberty interchangeably for this word, eleutheria. Bible translators, for example, use liberty and freedom to mean the same thing whenever this word is translated into English. Now, Moira M. Walsh wrote an article titled Aristotle's Conception of Freedom. According to Walsh, Aristotle, in his ancient work Politics, expressed a difference between the two words. Walsh pointed out that Aristotle held that most democracies fail because they define freedom badly. For Aristotle, the word eleutheria is juxtaposed to the word slavery. And for that matter, even in the New Testament, the use of the term eleutheria is contrasted with slavery. Of course, translating the words from Greek to English have their own problems, like translating the word slavery from ancient Greek has its own challenge. The English word robot, for example, comes from the Slavic word slave, which makes sense to me. A robot has no will of its own, is incapable of deliberation, and cannot apprehend ends and means using reason. A robot, furthermore, cannot exist for its own sake and not for another's sake. For this concept, I draw the inference that Aristotle's, quote, natural slave, end quote, is similar to today's word robot. In contrast to Aristotle's natural slave, he devised what he called the natural free man. Walsh wrote, "The natural free man not only perceives reason, but himself possesses it. He is capable of foresight and deliberation. He can apprehend appropriate ends and means towards those ends by the use of his own reason." Though Moira Walsh's statement is in keeping with Aristotle's preoccupation with reason, I am not so certain this is entirely accurate. In the book Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle tied reason to happiness, saying that happiness is the goal achieved by reason. However, I don't believe that reason is tied to happiness. It's not a goal that we achieve. Reason is a choice we make. Thus, freedom, just like happiness may not be connected to reason, freedom may not be connected to reason as well. However, I agree with Walsh's point that in Aristotle's concept of freedom, quote, I may be doing only what I desire and still fail to be free. If my desires are slavish, or if what I desire cannot be ordered to my ultimate end, that would be being happiness. So, in other words, to be free is not merely the ability to do whatever you want, but to do what is truly good, because that is our purpose, or our telos. Just as we find in the New Testament writings of the Apostle Paul, doing whatever our desires dictate is not freedom at all, but slavery. Paul describes the human condition as slaves to sin. Using the Slavic word robot, I propose this paraphrase. We should no longer be robots programmed to sin. And in Romans chapter 6 and throughout the Greek New Testament and Old Testament Septuagint, eletheria is used in opposition to slavery. So once again, my paraphrase is that we should no longer be robots programmed to sin. Another Greek word, exousia, which comes from the Greek root word existi, is translated authority, power, liberty, or rights. The word is juxtaposed to the law, so it is different from eletheria, which is contrasted to slavery. So liberty refers to law. Freedom refers to not being a slave. However, the distinction is a bit arbitrary and slippery and indefinite. Jeff Kennedy briefly examined the Latin word libertas in an article titled Cicero, Roman Republicanism and the Contested Meaning of Libertas. He explained the ambiguity of Cicero's usage of liberty. On the one hand, libertas, he does not seem to define liberty as a condition that exists on the one hand, he does seem to define liberty as a condition that exists in opposition to slavery. This definition is, as I stated earlier, seems to agree with the Greek word eletheria. On the other hand, Kennedy wrote, Cicero attributed a condition of liberty to Greek democracies, as opposed to what he favorably termed the free state. This definition is more closely related to the use of the Greek term exousia, or liberty, relating to law, civil, moral, or spiritual laws. Liberty is used in the New Testament to refer to the rights of believers with regard to moral and spiritual law. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, we read, "But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block for the weak." See, I suppose Paul's usage of the term liberty here could be taken to be similar to John Stuart Mill's concept in his essential work on liberty. His first couple of chapters deal with the liberty of thought and discussion. So if you're interested in further investigating the idea of liberty of thought, Luke Swain wrote a compelling argument in his article titled Freedom of Thought as a Basic Liberty. Mills quickly moved from liberty of thought to the discussion in the chapter titled Of the Limits to the Authority of Society over the Individual. And he began this section by asking 4 vital questions. So he asked, what then is the rightful limits of the sovereign over the individual? Where does the authority of society begin? How much of human life should be assigned to individuality, and how much to society? His discussion of liberty relates to social or civil liberty, so it would be akin to the word exousia. He invoked what he called the harm principle, which is most commonly summarized by the saying, the right to swing your fist, the right to swing my fist ends where other man's nose begins. Mill comes close to Paul's commands concerning the weaker brother. However, Paul tells us that though we have the authority or liberty, exousia, to act, we refrain from harming a weaker brother. So the difference between Mill's view and Paul's view is twofold. First, Paul is dealing with the voluntary yielding of rights to benefit a fellow believer. Mill suggests the government must step in to limit people's rights. That view leads to the government having power over individual rights rather than the rights of individuals limiting the power of government. The second difference is that Mill's harm principle is not well defined. Is the harm confined to harming my person physically or my property? Or if I am offended by something that you say or that you do, is that doing me harm? In other words, do I have the right not to be offended by you? In conclusion, I understand eleutheria as freedom in contrast to slavery. Even a person who purports to be free by nature, as Aristotle claimed, is in actuality a slave by nature in the sense of Romans chapter 6. But Paul's concept of slavery is not to be confused with the slavery that is assumed by Rousseau's opening statement, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Instead, the intellect, emotion, and volition of every human being is a slave to evil, or as I would have put it, is a robot programmed to sin. Freedom of that kind of slavery is only found in Jesus Christ. On the other hand, liberty in the Greek exousia and Latin libertas is a person's authority or rights concerning civil, moral, or spiritual laws. However, in the sense of eleutheria and exousia, the concept of freedom versus liberty is extremely fluid. So we cannot put too fine a point on that topic. I like how Kennedy concluded his argument. He said, when speaking of Roman libertas, we must take into account the contested meaning. So we cannot make a hard and fast rule about the difference between freedom and liberty. Oh, one more thing. And just to think about as an experiment, if you remember the movie Braveheart, Mel Gibson shouted out his last word, freedom. I wonder what he meant by that. Did he mean freedom from slavery, or did he mean liberty as a right under the law? Just something to think about. Well, thank you for listening, and I await your replies.